I can still picture the instant I stopped being wholly human, even if the date has been erased, drowned under endless strings of binharic code and liturgical downloads that now pass for memory. The recruiters had a phrase for it in their catechisms: the flesh moment. The hour the Omnissiah's grace would lift me out of weak biology and into something higher, purposeful, useful. Back then, I swallowed every word with the zeal of a lower hive kid who'd never tasted anything except rust, smog, and hunger. In the sump levels, the air sits on your tongue like corroded metal. Children learn to cough before they learn to speak. Hope is a rumor you trade for calories. The Adeptus Mechanicus arrived during a tithe levy. Their crimson robes looked unreal against our grime, clean lines of red moving through broken gantries and failing machines. Mechadendrites flowed around them with a smooth, deliberate elegance that felt almost obscene in a place built from sharp angles and desperate repairs. They told us they were seeking volunteers, bodies willing to become instruments of the machine god in the most direct way possible. The blessed, the soldiers of the Omnissiah. They didn't hide the terms. The offer was printed in plain, cold promises. Debt relief for your family. Improved protein rations for your registered dependents and for you. Transcendence beyond the limits of flesh. I signed without really understanding what I was purchasing. A scanner bit my thumb. Just a pinprick. Yet the single drop of blood that followed was immediately analyzed, catalogued, and filed before I'd even pulled my hand away. My mother cried. I never decided whether it was relief at the debt forgiveness or grief at losing her son to something she couldn't name. My father only nodded, his face already trained into that blank mask men grow when life has beaten every other expression out of them. The transport to the Forge world was the first time I'd ever left our planet. It was also my first time seeing the hive from above. An endless sprawl of corroded stone and metal stretching past the horizon, its countless lights flickering through toxic haze like dying stars. I pressed my face to the viewport as we climbed through the layers of atmosphere, watching my whole world shrink into a rust-colored smear beneath us. There were 37 of us aboard, all young, all drawn from the lower levels, all carrying the same desperate, stupid hope that ascent meant salvation. We didn't talk much. The cabin stank of industrial lubricant and recycled air, and the engines vibrated through the hull with the steady pulse of a mechanical heart. When we finally docked, the change hit like a fist, heat rolling over us as if someone had opened an oven door into our faces. The air was so dry it split my lips within minutes. The Forge world was not a city. It was a planet-wide factory. Refineries and manufactorum blocks swallowed the surface in every direction. Towers vomited smoke into a rust-colored sky that looked wrong, too orange, too thick, as if the atmosphere itself had been stained by industry. The sun was only a pale suggestion behind the haze. Tech priests met us on the landing platform. Augmetics gleamed in harsh light. What remained of their faces was calm and unreadable behind brass plates and steel grafts. They scanned us with humming devices, sorted us with quick, efficient motions, and spoke to one another in bursts of binharic that came out as machine noise sharp enough to make my teeth ache. The induction facility was a vast hall of white tile and stainless steel, flooded with lumen strips so bright they left nowhere for shadows to hide. They separated us almost immediately, different corridors, different doors, different futures, and I never saw most of those 37 again. My group was 7. They stripped us. Everything we owned was catalogued, sealed, and packed into containers labeled with our old names. Names we were told we wouldn't need for much longer. The examinations weren't medical in the way a human would mean it. They were inspections, thorough to the point of violation, every surface analyzed, blood taken in amounts that left me dizzy, genetic samples harvested with casual precision. They spoke in flat, emotionless low Gothic while they worked, reciting procedures, noting compliance, asking nothing and accepting no refusal. The first augmentation came the same day, before we'd been fed, before we'd had time to understand what volunteer truly meant. They called it basic integration, a cortical implant that would let them pour data streams and tactical downloads straight into the visual cortex. They used only local anesthetic. They wanted me awake. They said the experience mattered, part of the ritual of transformation. I felt the drill bite into my skull just above my right temple, felt vibration shudder through bone, heard the high, hateful whine of the motor, smelled burning bone dust, sharp, dry, unmistakable. Pain like white lightning split my thoughts apart. I screamed until my throat was raw, but the restraints held me perfectly still. The tech priest didn't pause or flinch. My suffering was just another metric, a heartbeat to record, a blood pressure to note on a data slate. When the implant seated, it felt wrong. A cold, foreign weight inside my head, pressing against the soft parts of my mind. Then they activated it. My vision detonated into overlays, targeting reticules, environmental readouts, streams of symbols and numbers I couldn't interpret. The world became a storm of information layered on top of reality. My stomach heaved. I vomited almost immediately, my brain choking on the flood. A tech priest adjusted a control panel without comment, dimming the display until I could breathe again. They gave us 3 hours to adapt. Those hours were spent in a white recovery cell with a hard bench, no windows, no distractions, just the alien presence in my skull and the dawning certainty that I'd crossed a threshold I could never step back over. The others were in adjacent cells. I heard one of them sobbing through the wall, muffled, desperate, unmistakably human. I didn't cry. Sometimes I wonder if that was my last chance to express an unedited emotion before the machine began pruning those reactions out of me. The process lasted 47 days, though time stopped behaving like time. Days and nights blurred into one endless cycle. Surgery, recovery, adaptation. Surgery again. They started with my legs, both removed with surgical lasers, while I watched in a mirror suspended above the table, unable to look away from my own disassembly. The biological remnants were pushed into an incinerator duct that opened directly from the operating theater. I smelled myself burning, sweet, acrid, and intimate in the worst possible way. It's an odor that never truly leaves you once it becomes part of your life. The replacements were masterpieces, hydraulics, servos, armored plating, every joint calibrated beyond human norms. When they powered them up, I stood a few inches taller. My stride lengthened. Efficiency replaced instinct. Microcogitators in the joints calculated each step. I could feel the legs move, but sensation arrived as translation, signals and numbers pretending to be touch. I practiced walking for hours while tech priests watched, making tiny adjustments to response curves as if tuning a machine. Then my arms. Left first, then a week later, the right. Combat-rated augmentics, built to handle Skitarii weapons with steadiness no flesh could match. The hands were too precise, fingers that could manipulate micrometer-thin components one moment and crush rockcrete the next. They left my shoulders organic, claiming it preserved major nerve clusters and blood flow, but from the joint downward I was steel and synth muscle. A generator was implanted in my chest. It drew on my own metabolism and carried a backup cell capable of feeding my augmetics for 3 days if my organic systems failed. The sensory work was quieter and somehow more unsettling. They replaced my eyes with auger sensors that saw across spectrums, infrared to ultraviolet, complete with range finding and targeting assistance. The world sharpened into ruthless clarity, yet it also became stranger. Everything tagged, measured, annotated. I had to learn to see past the data to the object underneath. They enhanced my hearing, installing receptor nodes that could peel a whisper out of chaos from 100 meters away, or cut through artillery roar to isolate a command vox. They dulled my sense of smell on purpose. They said battlefields could break untrained minds with stench alone, but they tuned other receptors for chemical signatures, promethium, explosives, pheromonal markers associated with certain xeno strains. Touch was the oddest. They couldn't strip it away entirely without driving me into collapse, so they shaped it instead, modulating what remained of my biological skin and teaching the sensors in my augmetic limbs to translate mechanical input into something my brain would accept as tactile experience. The result was a doubled awareness. I could feel a surface and also read it. Pressure in kilopascals, temperature to fractions of a degree, texture coefficients, the intimacy of sensation paired with the cold distance of data. Every contact reminded me my body was no longer fully mine. Every feeling mediated by systems that could be calibrated, throttled, or turned off if the machine god's servants decided it was necessary. The cognitive work began in the 3rd week, once my body stopped rejecting its new configuration. Those were the changes that pushed me over the line, from augmented human into Skitari. They explained it as optimization, the ability to receive tactical feeds, coordinate flawlessly with a squad, suppress biological impulses that reduced combat efficiency. First came the emotional dampener, installed at the base of my brain. It didn't erase feelings, so they claimed, but it controlled amplitude. Fear could be softened before it became panic. Rage could be clipped before it became recklessness. When they activated it, the world didn't go numb. It went distant. I could still feel fear, anger, grief, but as if someone had wrapped them in heavy cloth, muffling the edges. My thoughts became cleaner, straighter, unburdened by the constant noise of raw emotion. It was peaceful in a way that frightened me. I wasn't sure if the calm belonged to me or if it was simply the serenity of imposed regulation. Next came the tactical data port, a direct neural interface for battlefield command systems. When plugged into a network, orders arrived as pure information instead of spoken words. Coordinates became instinct, felt like locations my body already knew. Threat assessments arrived as certainty, not suggestion. Squad positions registered like an extension of my own proprioception, as if my squad mates were limbs of a shared body. They tested us relentlessly, simulation after simulation. They built the pathways until synchronized operation stopped being training and became reflex. Weapons instruction began as soon as we could walk and manipulate tools with our new bodies. They issued us galvanic rifles, holy instruments of the Omnissiah, their coils anointed, their casings marked with Binharic catechisms. Ancient technology wrapped in reverent craft, capable of hurling electromagnetically accelerated rounds with impossible consistency. The first time I fired, my augmetic arms drank the recoil without movement. The barrel stayed perfectly steady as hypersonic rounds screamed down range. My new eyes tracked flight paths, computed drift and drop, and painted solutions across my vision in numbers I learned to read without thinking. We shot for hours every day, thousands of rounds into targets, static silhouettes, moving drones, hololithic enemy forms. Tech priests watched everything, tweaking targeting routines, tuning response patterns, pushing new combat algorithms into us during sleep cycles so we woke carrying knowledge we hadn't earned. I learned to field strip and rebuild the rifle in darkness. Learned to clear malfunctions by touch. Learned the maintenance hymns that had to be spoken while cleaning its components. The weapon became more intimate than my own hands, an extension of purpose, a conduit for the Omnissiah's will. Indoctrination never stopped. It threaded through training, recovery, even rest. Sermons in the Manufactorum chapels, vast spaces where crimson-robed priests led us through the litanies of the machine. We chanted Binharic hymns, with voices increasingly shaped by vox synths implanted in our throats. The doctrine was absolute. The machine god was divine. The Omnissiah was the avatar. Flesh was weakness. Integration was purity. Doubt was malfunction. Emotion was corruption. The individual was nothing beside the function they served. They showed us curated battle recordings, Skitari cohorts advancing in perfect synchronization through storms of fire while unaugmented soldiers broke and ran. They showed forge worlds as cathedrals of purpose, perfect systems, sacred efficiency. They showed worlds consumed by Xenos, populations enslaved or devoured, the Imperium's light smothered in the void. There was no room to question what had been done to us. We were told we were fortunate, elevated beyond common humanity. Blessed, I believed them, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say, I lost the ability to disbelieve. Acceptance and inability to reject blurred together as the programs ran through my altered architecture, smoothing rough thoughts into compliant shapes. The final augmentation came on the 47th day. It was the one I feared most, though I didn't admit that fear to myself until the moment they guided me into the surgical theater. They called it a doctrinal programming matrix, a device designed to allow direct upload of tactics, doctrine, and imperative protocols, responses that could override conscious decision-making when hesitation would cost the mission or the squad. The tech priest explained it as mercy and efficiency, faster than thought, faster than fear, faster than doubt. It would be installed deep in my brain, woven into the dampener and the data port, a unified system to regulate thought, feeling, and action according to predetermined parameters. I wanted to refuse. I wanted to run. But when the command was given, my augmetics moved me forward. My arms positioned themselves for restraint without my permission. My legs carried me to the table as if my will was an irrelevant input, and in that moment, cold clarity settled over me. The ability to truly resist had been removed in earlier stages. The rebellion I imagined I still possessed was only a story my mind told itself. The drill screamed again, hated music I'd learned to recognize instantly, and new violations took root behind my eyes. Foreign presences nesting in tissue that had once been entirely mine. Activation wasn't like the others. It hit like a flood. Tactical scenarios, room-clearing patterns, artillery advance protocols, threat response trees, downloaded into my mind as if they were memories I'd always carried. I knew how to move through a structure. I knew how to coordinate fire with a squad for maximum effect. I knew how to advance through chaos with mechanical certainty. I knew these things the way I knew my own name, except my name no longer felt like my own. Alpha 7 Theta 9, designation and function, sat more naturally in my thoughts than the sound my mother used to call me in that distant hive that now felt like a life belonging to someone else. After completion, training escalated. Individual proficiency became squad doctrine. Squad doctrine became cohort maneuver. They formed us into squads of 10 Skitari, specialized roles, unified through the tactical network into a single coordinated organism. My designation placed me as standard infantry, galvanic rifle, sustained fire support, medium-range threat elimination. And that was the final truth of it. Not the transformation, not the transcendence, the function, a numbered part in a larger machine, built to move when commanded, to kill when directed, and to believe without struggle that this was holy purpose. Others in my squad carried arc rifles for breaking heavily armored targets, or transuranic arquebuses for the precise elimination of high-value objectives at extreme range. We had a squad leader, designated Alpha Prime, whose augmentations were more extensive than any of ours. He bore a direct command link into the cohort control network, and the tactical matrix woven into his mind coordinated our movements with a precision that felt almost precognitive, as if he was always half a second ahead of what the battlefield would become. We trained everywhere the Forge world could fabricate. Urban ruins of shattered hab blocks, industrial complexes of catwalks and piping, open plains under polluted winds, hostile flora engineered to cut or poison, subterranean tunnels that narrowed into choking dark, void ship corridors, tight metallic arteries designed to funnel men into kill zones. We learned to fight in vacuum, sealed inside environment suits that interfaced seamlessly with our augmetics. Our enhanced lungs could function on minimal oxygen for extended periods, and our systems rationed every breath like a sacred resource. We learned to fight in toxic atmospheres, our respiratory tracts rebuilt with filtration augmetics that could scrub all but the most corrosive gases from the air. We learned to fight in extremes of heat and cold, our thermal regulation systems maintaining performance in conditions that would kill unaugmented humans in minutes. The training was brutal. Casualties were not uncommon. Skitari, who fell during exercises, were not mourned. Their still functional augmetics were harvested. Their organic remnants were sent to corpse starch processing plants that fed the Forge world's population. There were no ceremonies for the dead, no prayers of farewell beyond a line of Benharic notation in the cohort records and the redistribution of equipment to replacement units. I watched squad mates fall in live fire drills, watched them die from augmetic malfunctions, from failures of judgment, or from the simple randomness of violence, even under controlled conditions, and I felt nothing, or rather, I felt the dampened echo of what might once have been grief, a distant acknowledgement of loss that never rose high enough to interfere with training protocols. The emotional dampener did its work. The function continued. The deployment order came as deployment orders always came in the Adeptus Mechanicus, without warning, without softness. We assembled at morning muster. 300 Skitari stood in flawless ranks on the parade ground beneath the rust-colored sky. Amagos, wrapped in elaborate ceremonial augmentations, informed us that we were deemed combat-ready. We would be deployed to a war zone where the Omnissiah's interests required military action. The nature of the conflict was classified above our clearance level, but the mission summary was clear enough. Recovery of archaeotech. From a world that had fallen to Xenos infestation, we were to secure the Forge complexes long enough for the tech priests to extract the sacred technology before orbital bombardment sterilized the planet. We would deploy in 72 hours, enough time for final equipment checks and for the upload of environment-specific tactics. The announcement was met with absolute silence. No cheers, No prayers spoken in voices, no visible excitement or dread. Only 300 augmented soldiers receiving orders with the calm compliance of well-maintained machinery. I felt something anyway, faint, fluttering beneath the dampener's veil. A mixture of anticipation and dread my implants couldn't entirely suppress. This was what I had been built for, what all the pain and surgeries and indoctrination had prepared me to do. One part of me, still stubbornly human, was terrified. Another part, cleaner, colder, was eager to justify my transformation by fulfilling my function. The transport was a bulk hauler configured for war. Its cargo holds had been converted into deployment bays, where Skitarii cohorts were racked into suspension frames for transit. We boarded in orderly lines, each carrying assigned weapons and wearing standard-issue armor, reinforced plates protecting the remaining vital biological components, integrated with our augmetic systems to add protection without impeding function. Embarkation took hours. 300 Skitarii filed into the hold and secured themselves into frames that immobilized us for the journey through the warp. The frames interfaced directly with our systems, feeding nutrients intravenously, managing waste, uploading data streams to keep tactical programming current in transit. We remained conscious throughout, unable to move, unable to shift. Aware of the metal embrace around our bodies and the slow drip of information into our minds. A ship's tech priest explained it clinically. Keeping us active maintained the neural pathways and muscle tone even our augmetics required, preventing degradation during extended inactivity. Full stasis was possible, but bulk haulers did not carry the necessary equipment or power reserves. So we rode to war awake and restrained, fed tactical briefings and environmental parameters about the destination. Minds kept sharp while bodies waited in metal wombs. Warp transit was unlike anything my training could truly prepare me for. When the ship entered the Imperium, something in reality bent the wrong way. My tactical overlays flooded with error states. Targeting reticules refused to lock. Environmental sensors returned impossible readings, distances that contradicted themselves, temperatures that swung between extremes without transition, atmospheric compositions that could not exist. The frame held me rigid, but I could feel my body trying to rebel anyway, instinct screaming warnings deeper than thought. The tech priests had uploaded data about the warp, about Geller fields and the protections they provided. Data and experience are not the same thing. Time became meaningless. The chronometers still counted, but the numbers felt arbitrary. Seconds stretched into subjective hours, hours compressed into instants. My augmented mind strained against the contradiction, trying to reconcile what could not be reconciled. I heard things through the hull. Sounds that shouldn't exist, voices that spoke in languages I didn't know, yet somehow understood. Whispers offering promises my dampened emotions couldn't fully process, while some primal core of me recoiled in wordless horror. I saw things too. My augmetic eyes displayed images that disagreed with the ship's internal picked recorders. Shadows moving against light, figures in corridors I knew were empty. Other Skitarii reported similar anomalies over the squad vox, voices flat and controlled even as they described the impossible. Alpha Prime answered in bursts of binharic that triggered suppression subroutines, filters and overrides that stabilized perception just enough to maintain function. The warp transit lasted 14 days by the ship's chronometer. It felt both shorter and longer than that. Time losing its reliable shape in the space between spaces. When we translated back into real space, the transition was violently abrupt. Reality snapped into place with a jolt I felt through the suspension frame. Sensor readings stabilized. Measurements regained meaning. The tactical display populated instantly with fresh data. We had arrived in system. Approach to the target world had begun. Deployment was scheduled 20 hours after translation. The world had no name in our briefing, only an alphanumeric designation, coordinates and parameters. It had been a Forge world until it went silent 3 months prior. All Vox traffic ceased. Investigation confirmed Xenos infestation, classified only as Threat Tertiary Omega. The planet was considered lost, but within its forge, complexes was archaeotech the Mechanicus would not allow to fall into Xenos' hands, or be destroyed in the orbital bombardment that would eventually cleanse the world. Our mission was simple in concept and impossible in execution. Secure the primary forge complex. Hold it while the tech priests extracted critical technology. Then evacuate before the bombardment began. Estimated operation time, 72 hours. Estimated casualty rate, classified. I ran probability calculations anyway, and arrived at figures between 40 and 90%, depending on variables I could not fully model. The doctrinal matrix converted the probability of my own death into a tactical factor, something to allocate, not fear. We were released from the suspension frame 6 hours before deployment. Time enough for equipment checks and final downloads. The ship held stable orbit now, and the picked feeds showed what we would descend into. A planet that had once been red-gray with industrial pollution was now covered in creeping purple-green growth. Vast carpets of xenoflora consumed the forge sprawls, pulsing and shifting even in orbital imagery. The briefing identified it as tyrannid biomatter, a living carpet laid down by hive fleets designed to digest a world into based nutrients to be harvested by the greater organism. The target forge complex was partially consumed. Its structures were wrapped in biomass like a corpse being digested. Yet the core facilities remained structurally intact, protected by adamantium reinforcement built to endure the stresses of heavy industry. We would deploy by drop pod, landing directly adjacent to the complex. Establish perimeter. Hold against assault while the tech priests worked. Simple. Impossible. Certain death for most. My emotional dampener kept my mind calm while my hindbrain screamed terror the implants couldn't fully silence. The drop pod was brutally uncomplicated. An armored shell, shock-absorbing interior, retro thrusters for terminal deceleration. Each pod carried a full squad of 10. We were loaded in our designated groups and strapped into harnesses designed to keep us from being pulped by the forces to come. Inside, the air smelled of machine oil and recycled ventilation. Red emergency lighting painted my squad mates' faces, what remained of them, in uniform gloom. Augmetic eyes glowed softly. Expressions stayed blank, fear and doubt stripped from the surface by dampeners and doctrine. We waited in silence, linked by the tactical network. Readiness confirmations and status checks passed without spoken words. Launch was violence. A sudden acceleration slammed me into the harness with a force that would have broken unaugmented bones. The pod shuddered as it was flung from the ship's launch tubes toward the world below. My augmented senses tracked the trajectory. I felt the pod tumble as it hit atmosphere. I heard air scream against the hull as friction heated the exterior to temperatures that would melt flesh. Retro thrusters fired in staccato bursts, correcting spin, bleeding speed from suicidal to merely catastrophic. Final deceleration crushed vision into a narrowing tunnel. Blood drained from my brain despite augmented cardiovascular reinforcement. Impact slammed through every bolt and rivet. The shock absorbers screamed as they devoured the last of the kinetic force. For a heartbeat, There was silence. Absolute ringing. Then explosive charges detonated. The hatch blew outward in petals of armored metal, and we stepped into war. The world was immediately hostile in ways briefing data could not convey. The air was thick with spores and pollutants, a purple-tinged haze that cut visibility to less than 100 meters. My respiratory filtration engaged automatically, scrubbing toxins, but I still tasted it. Bitter, organic, clinging to mouth and throat. The ground beneath my augmetic feet was soft and yielding. Tyrannid biomatter formed a carpet of interwoven living structures that pulsed with internal rhythm. It responded to our presence by rippling, shifting, sending chemical signals through the vast planetary network. Thermal sensors reported the biomass warmer than ambient, heat generated by relentless metabolism. Audio sensors picked up movement from every direction, skittering, wet sliding sounds, distant screeches and roars that spoke of predators already aware of us. The forge complex rose ahead, dark structures wrapped in growth. Thick strands climbed walls like obscene ivy, forcing entry through every opening, beginning the slow consumption of metal and stone to feed a hunger that never ended. Other pods had landed around the perimeter. Our cohort dispersed into defensive positions according to doctrine, assigned sectors, overlapping fields of fire, a killing ground established with mechanical certainty. We didn't wait long. The Tyranids came 15 minutes after landing. The biomatter erupted as organisms surged from beneath its surface, lying dormant until prey arrived. Small creatures first, hormagaunts. By the briefing, hundreds of them, a chittering mass of bladed xenos charging across the living carpet with terrifying speed. My targeting systems locked onto the swarm. Priority targets marked. Optimal fire patterns calculated. The doctrinal matrix executed engagement protocols before my conscious mind finished naming the threat. I raised my galvanic rifle and fired. Electromagnetically accelerated rounds punched into the oncoming mass. Each shot tracked by augmetic eyes. Each impact confirmed and logged. The projectiles tore through chitin and flesh with savage efficiency. Hydrostatic shock shattering internals, dropping xenos with every hit. Around me, my squad fired in synchronized rhythm, coordinated by the tactical network. No wasted shots, no redundancy, interlocking kill zones stitched together so tightly that nothing should have crossed alive. Hormagaunts died in heaps, their bodies piled onto the biomass carpet, which began absorbing fluids immediately, recycling the dead into the hive's resource pool as we created it. But they kept coming, driven by a hunger that made individual survival irrelevant. And I killed. And killed. And killed. My augmetic arms held the rifle perfectly steady. Targeting never faltered. Ammunition count dropped in steady increments, while some distant fragment of me wondered, quietly, absurdly, whether we could ever carry enough rounds to kill a planet that wanted to eat us. Then the larger organisms came. Warriors, carnifexes, bioweapons bred for war. Thick carapace resisted standard rounds unless we concentrated fire or struck seams. Alpha Prime redirected our output through the network, designating targets by weapon type, coordinating arcs of fire, allocating specialized arms where they mattered most. I watched an arc rifle wielder engage a Tyrannid warrior. Lightning leapt from the weapon, arcing across the haze to strike the creature. Electricity danced over its armor, hunted weak points, cooked it from within until it collapsed in twitching ruin. I watched a transuranic arquebus fire a single measured shot. The round crossed the distance with terrifying elegance and punched through a carnifex at a seam in its plating. The specialized payload detonated inside the creature, rupturing it from within and scattering wet biomass across the battlefield. War became rhythm, a mechanical sequence of acquisition, elimination, ammunition management, and movement between cover. Time stopped being minutes and seconds. It became a continuous present of targets and solutions. Violence as mathematics, executed with applied precision. The dampener kept my mind clean and focused. But my remaining organic systems began to fail. Heart racing, lungs burning despite enhancement, skin slick with sweat that evaporated into spore-thick air. Augmetics performed flawlessly while flesh struggled to keep up. The first deaths in my squad came in the third wave. A sustained push overwhelmed part of our perimeter. Theta 4 took a bioweapon hit, an organic projectile that struck his chest and burst, splashing corrosive acid that ate through armor and the biology beneath. He fell. He screamed. Then the Vox synthesizer mangled the sound into static. His body thrashed in the burning fluid until emergency protocols engaged. The doctrinal matrix flooded his system with sedatives strong enough to stop his heart rather than allow prolonged suffering. His augmetics would be recovered later. If we survived, Theta 4's body was left where it fell. I understood, with cold certainty, that it would be consumed by the Tyrannid carpet, converted into resources for the enemy we fought. Theta 9 died next. Smaller organisms broke through a weak point and swarmed him. They pulled him down despite augmetic strength, tearing him apart in a frenzy of claws and teeth. His final moments came across the squad network as pure data, vitals collapsing, damage reports cascading, system failures stacking, then abrupt silence as his components died. And still the protocols ran. Still the line held. Still my rifle fired. I felt nothing as my squad mates died, nothing in the way a man is supposed to feel. If anything reached me at all, it was only the ghost of grief or horror, muffled and delayed, too weak to interrupt function. My dampeners and doctrine translated death into numbers, reduced squad strength, altered firing arcs, revised coverage, ammunition burn rate, probability of line failure. We held the perimeter for 16 hours without pause. The Tyranids came in waves, each one breaking against our positions with varying degrees of success, and we answered them with the same mechanical persistence. By the end of that first engagement window, 42 Skitari from our cohort had been lost. 14%. Within acceptable parameters, my mind computed automatically, as if I were balancing inventory rather than counting the dead. During a lull, brief enough to feel unreal, the tech priests arrived. Their transport set down inside our defensive ring, and they moved immediately to their true purpose. They entered the forge complex with servitors and specialized tools and began extracting the archaeotech judged worthy of this expenditure. We kept the line while they worked. We repelled probing attacks. We rationed power. We conserved ammunition when we could and spent it when we had to. My galvanic rifle ran hot despite its cooling systems. In the quiet seconds between alarms, I performed field maintenance by rote, hands moving through familiar patterns of disassembly and cleaning while I recited the litanies of function. Around us, the Tyrannid biomatter pulsed and shifted, absorbing the fallen from both sides and breaking them down into fuel. It crept forward, even as we burned it back with flamers and incendiaries, as if it had all the time in the galaxy. It did, I realized. Not patience in the way a man understands patience, but the slow certainty of a vast organism that could afford to spend thousands of lesser bodies in testing attacks while it tightened its grip. It didn't need to win quickly. It only needed to keep closing, The second major assault struck after 28 hours planetside, and it was not a repeat of the first. It was coordinated. The swarm had learned. It had watched our fields of fire, measured our response times, mapped the seams in our perimeter. It hit from 3 directions at once, concentrating strength at points we had not reinforced enough. My sector held, but positions adjacent to mine were overrun. Skitari fell back in a fighting retreat while Xenos poured through the breach. Orders arrived through the tactical network. Fall back to secondary positions. Establish a new line closer to the Forge complex entrance. My augmetic legs carried me across the battlefield at speeds no unaugmented body could sustain. My targeting systems tracked threats even while I moved. I fired on the run with an accuracy that should not have been possible. Weapon and senses and doctrine fused into a single moving solution. At the secondary line, the fighting became intimate, close, desperate, ugly. Skitari fired at near point-blank range. Some drew integrated melee weapons when the swarm reached contact distance. I watched Alpha 6 engage a Terranid warrior in close combat. His augmetic arms swung a power axe that crackled with disruptive energy, splitting chitin and meat, while his armor absorbed claw strikes that would have disemboweled a normal man. He killed the warrior, but the cost was immediate. His armor ruptured. Biological components were exposed, bleeding freely into spore-thick air. He remained in the line for 40 minutes after that. Still upright, still facing the enemy, still holding his weapon, until blood loss finally shut down what flesh remained. He collapsed without ceremony, dying the way we were designed to die, in function. The tech priests completed extraction after 41 hours of continuous operations. They emerged from the Forge complex with servitors loaded down with recovered archaeotech, data cores, component assemblies, sealed relic units that justified, in Mechanicus arithmetic, every life spent to retrieve them. The evacuation order followed immediately. It arrived as a priority override that began executing before my conscious mind finished reading it. Fall back to extraction 2 kilometers distant. Landers would recover what remained of the cohort and return it to orbit. The withdrawal was not a retreat in any human sense. It was a controlled collapse. Squads alternating cover and movement, trading ground for time, paying for each meter with ammunition and bodies. My squad was designated rear guard for our section. That meant we would leave last. It meant our casualty probability spiked. It meant we were statistically unlikely to survive. My doctrinal matrix accepted this without emotion and adjusted priorities accordingly. Maximize cohort disengagement, even if we did not. The retreat became a nightmare of continuous combat. Every step forward was purchased. The Tyranids sensed withdrawal and pressed harder, flinging themselves at our moving lines with a ferocity that made their earlier waves look restrained. I fired my galvanic rifle until it overheated despite its systems, swapping power cells 3 times in rapid succession. My augmetic arms began to ache, an odd, translated fatigue, while my targeting suite struggled to sort and rank the overwhelming density of threats. Skitari fell around me in a steady hemorrhage of casualties. Theta 7 was torn apart by a carnifex that smashed through our line. Alpha 3 disappeared under a flood of smaller organisms that boiled up from beneath the biomatter. Beta 2 took a bioweapon hit that melted through armor and killed him instantly. His death entered my log with the same indifferent precision that tracked my remaining charge and ammunition. The extraction zone came into view, an area burned clear of biomass, scorched down to something that resembled ground. Landers descended on pillars of retrothrust. Skitarii were already boarding in designated groups. My squad reached the perimeter. 5 of us remained from the original 10. We turned and laid down covering fire for the next squad falling back. Evacuation was chaos despite the network. Too many units, too few ramps, too little time, and the swarm closing from every direction. I forced my way toward a boarding ramp, shoved forward by the crowd, firing backward at pursuing Xenos almost on instinct, while the remaining sliver of conscious thought fixated on one objective: get inside. I made it up the ramp and into the troop bay. Wounded and functional were packed together without comfort or dignity. The ramp began to close before everyone could board, leaving the slowest and most damaged outside because the mathematics of evacuation demanded liftoff before the lander was swallowed. Through the narrowing gap, I watched Skitarii, who hadn't made it, fight to the last seconds of their lives, buying delay with their bodies while the engines climbed to full power. Liftoff crushed us against the deck. Through the lander's external picked feeds, the battlefield fell away. The tyrannid carpet spread over everything we had bled to defend. The forge complex vanished beneath purple-green growth that would eventually digest all we'd left behind. Once we reached orbit, the final casualty report pushed through the tactical network. 173 lost from 300, a casualty rate of 57.6%. Slightly above the acceptable threshold, but still within mission margin. The tech priests had recovered their archaeotech. The operation was stamped successful. We had fulfilled our function. Return to the forge world blurred into processing bays and repair racks. Biological components were assessed for damage. Augmetic assemblies were evaluated and serviced. I carried injuries I hadn't registered in the fighting. Microfractures in leg supports, servo wear in rifle arm assemblies, minor armor breaches that had exposed tissue to spore-saturated air. They repaired what needed repairing, replaced what no longer met optimal tolerances, uploaded my after-action logs for analysis and integration into revised training doctrine. I spent 3 days in a medical facility, racked among other damaged Skitarii. Tech priests moved between us with the detached efficiency of mechanics servicing equipment. Because that is what we were. Psychological evaluation was perfunctory. Brain function scanned. Dampeners verified. Cognitive integrity confirmed. Clearance returned. There was no therapy. No discussion, no acknowledgement that I had watched squad mates die, killed hundreds of organisms, and spent hours certain my end was imminent. These were not traumas. They were inputs and outputs, filed into the great ledger of the Mechanicus. I had performed within metrics. That was sufficient. The cohort was rebuilt with replacements, fresh from augmentation, carrying the same starving hope I once carried when I arrived, not yet understanding that hope was simply another reaction to be dampened into usefulness. I watched them during training. I saw my own transformation replayed, awkward movements in new bodies, then smooth competence, then the dimming behind the augmetic eyes as programming settled in, and doubt was sanded down to nothing. I tried sometimes to remember what it felt like to feel fully. The memories were there, perfectly preserved, crystal clear in enhanced recall. But they didn't feel like mine. They felt like recordings of someone else's life. In quiet moments in the barracks, when my cognition wasn't consumed by weapons maintenance or tactical review, I wondered if my mother had received the promised compensation. If the hive debt had truly been erased, if the ration increase had changed anything meaningful. I had no way to know, no channel to ask. My prior life had been severed as cleanly as my limbs. I was Skitarii, property of the Adeptus Mechanicus. My purpose was to fight and kill and die when required. My past had no operational value. My future was a probability curve that bent toward termination. Deployments continued. They blended together despite perfect recall, because war is repetitive when reduced to logged parameters. We fought orcs on a contested forge world, green brutes hurling themselves at our lines with suicidal fervor. They died in heaps under coordinated fire, and still came, driven by whatever passed for courage or madness in their brutal minds. I killed hundreds over 3 days of continuous fighting, my rifle punching through crude armor, targeting systems compensating for erratic movement, doctrinal routines, selecting optimal bursts without conscious thought. We took casualties. Always casualties. The cohort was rebuilt each time, new faces in old slots. The cycle continued. We fought Eldar raiders striking a research station, enemies who moved with inhuman speed and precision. Their weapons spoke death with accuracy that challenged even augmented tracking. But they bled and died like any other Xenos when our fire found them. We fought traitor humans on a rebellious industrial world. Killing humans disturbed something buried deep, because their faces could have been mine, because their eyes carried fear and desperation that my dampeners no longer allowed me to experience at full intensity. I killed them anyway, as efficiently as I killed Xenos. My programming did not care what species wore the label threat. It only cared that the label existed. Attrition changed the cohort slowly, inevitably. Of the original 7 in my augmentation group, I was the only one left after the 4th deployment. The others died in different wars. Their names and termination circumstances remained in my records. Their augmetics recovered and repurposed. Their biological remnants recycled. I was promoted, if that word still applied, to Alpha 6, a senior slot in my squad. It reflected accumulated combat data and the statistical anomaly of my survival. Most Skitarii did not survive past 3 major deployments. Probability caught everyone in time. Yet I reached 7 deployments. I logged more combat hours than most of the cohort. The tech priests noticed. They monitored my performance more closely. During maintenance windows, they added modifications, improved targeting algorithms, refined threat assessment, doctrinal upgrades derived from veteran pattern analysis. I became more effective, and that effectiveness made me more likely to be deployed where effectiveness was most needed, which meant my termination probability increased, even as my individual capability improved. My existence settled into a closed loop. Deployment, combat, survival or death, repair, training, deployment, again. No meaning beyond service, no identity beyond designation and statistics. I no longer ate like a man. Nutrition arrived through automated systems calibrated to the minimum requirements of what flesh remained. I did not sleep in human rhythms. Rest cycles were scheduled to preserve cognition while minimizing downtime. I rarely spoke. Communication moved through the tactical network, Binharic more efficient than Low Gothic. When my Vox did output speech, it was flat, stripped of the inflections that once carried feeling. Humanity bled away incrementally, so slowly I could not name the moment it happened. I couldn't tell when I stopped being a human with machine parts and became a machine with human parts. Maybe it was the first drill into my skull. Maybe later. Maybe it never stopped happening. Each deployment removing one more layer that the dampeners and doctrine could not replace. I began to malfunction in my 12th year of service. At first it was minor, targeting glitches that resolved after reboot. Brief lapses in dampening where emotions surged through like floodwater, full weight of accumulated grief and horror crashing into me, before systems re-engaged and sealed it away again. The tech priests noted each incident, ran diagnostics, and identified where in neural interface components. Degradation at the junction between biology and machine. Expected, they said. My augmetics were built for a service life of approximately 10 years. I had exceeded that. Survival, beyond statistical averages, had pushed systems past optimal parameters. They could repair some wear, replace degraded components, but there were limits. Interfaces could only be reworked so many times before permanent damage to brain tissue became unavoidable. I was approaching those limits. My viability as a combat unit was declining. The recommendation in my service assessment was simple and merciless. Maintain current deployment schedule until termination. Maximize utilization of remaining functional period. Then harvest augmetics for redistribution and recycle biological components. I accessed the file during routine data review. I read my own death sentence in clinical terms and felt almost nothing, only the pale shadow of despair, immediately muted by systems engineered to keep me operational until final failure. The next deployment began like all the others. Assembly, briefing, boarding, transit, warp, translation, descent into another wall. We were sent to suppress an uprising on a hive world, locals resisting tithe collection. Imperial forces required augmentation to restore order. It was projected as routine, overwhelming force applied to break poorly armed civilians. Intelligence was wrong. When we deployed, we met well-equipped insurgents fighting from prepared positions, armed with military-grade weapons, coordinated through disciplined command networks that spoke of professional training. The fighting was immediate and brutal. Our cohort took heavy losses in the first hours, ambushes, kill zones, and jamming that disrupted network coordination. My squad scattered during the opening chaos, separated across the combat zone. I found myself alone in the lower hive. My systems struggled against enemies who knew the terrain, who struck from shadow and vanished before I could acquire them, who used methods my doctrine did not adequately cover. I fought for 3 days through dark corridors, ammunition thinning, power cells draining, biological systems failing from exhaustion and inadequate intake. On the second day, my emotional dampener failed completely. Everything it had held back came rushing in. Fear, grief, horror. The deaths of squad mates across years, returning as if they had all happened at once. The weight of lives I had taken, the realization of what I had become, felt not as data, but as a wound. I felt afraid. Purely, fully, the survival instinct that had been regulated into quiet compliance snapped back with primal violence. And I wanted to live, not to serve, not to continue function, just to exist. To not end as recycled matter and redistributed parts, to matter as more than a line in a record. But my augmetics were failing. Hydraulics leaked from damage I couldn't repair. Servos ground with the sound of imminent collapse. Targeting glitched constantly, my vision filled with errors and false contacts, making it difficult to separate real threats from phantoms. My rifle jammed twice and required manual clearing both times. Tolerances had degraded beyond acceptable thresholds. I was breaking down, machine and flesh together, held together by will and failing programming. On the 4th day, I reached a rally point and found others from the cohort. Our numbers were shattered. Orders arrived. Fall back to extraction. The retreat was agony. Fighting every step, leaving dead Skitari behind us as we traded lives for distance. I watched them die deaths that should have been mine years earlier. their termination simply occurring earlier on the curve than mine had. I made it to the extraction zone and staggered up the lander's ramp on failing legs. I collapsed in the troop bay while others moved around me. Orbit. Transfer to medical processing. The tech priests assessed me with instruments and in different language. Multiple system failures, neural interface degradation beyond repair threshold, biological exhaustion advanced, continued viability questionable. Recommended action: decommission unit and harvest components. I heard them discuss my disassembly as if I were a vehicle slated for scrap. And because my dampeners were gone, I felt terror with no filter. Then they offered me a choice: immediate decommissioning or reassignment via servitor conversion. Consciousness preserved in simplified form, body rebuilt into a labor unit for maintenance or menial function. A third option existed, rarely chosen: disconnection. Removal of augmetic support. Return to purely biological existence for whatever brief time my damaged body could sustain. Each option delivered with the same clinical neutrality. No kindness, no malice, just procedure. I tried to speak, but my vox had failed. My voice came out wet and raw from a throat unused to natural sound. I gestured for a data slate and typed my choice with fingers that barely obeyed. I chose disconnection. I chose to die closer to human than I had been for years. I chose to feel death as flesh, not as a system failure. They processed the request as efficiently as everything else. I was transferred to a medical bay. Interfaces were removed, systems powered down, connections severed. Consciousness gradually peeled away from the machinery that had sustained it. It was agony. Each shutdown felt like losing a sense, like the world shrinking. My augmetic eyes went dark, and suddenly I saw only through biological vision that had been secondary for years, dim, blurred, limited. Data overlays vanished, leaving raw sensation, unfiltered and unhelpful. My hearing collapsed back to human range. Sound became muffled. My limbs grew heavy as mechanical strength drained away, leaving weak muscles that could barely hold me. What remained was a body that had been kept as a life support for the machine. Organs neglected for years, now asked to bear weight they were never trained to carry. They moved me to a recovery cell, a small room, a bed. More mercy than I expected. They did not tell me how long I had. Hours, perhaps days if my body proved stubborn. I lay there and felt everything: pain, exhaustion, damage the augmetics had been compensating for. Every breath hurt. My heart stuttered. My remaining limbs trembled with weakness, but I could feel it. I could experience my ending as a human experience rather than a diagnostic cascade. There was something almost precious in that. Being allowed to die as something near what I had been born as, instead of disappearing as machinery reaching end of life. In those final hours, I thought about my mother. I wondered if she still lived in the hive, if the compensation had been real, if my transformation had improved her life in any way that mattered. I thought about the person I had been before augmentation, the naive youth who believed propaganda about transcendence and purpose, who signed his life away with a thumbprint and a drop of blood. I thought about those I'd killed. Xenos, traitors, rebels. I wondered if they had faced death with the same fear I felt now, if they had also thought of mothers, homes and lives that might have been different. I thought about my squad mates. I wondered if their deaths were quick, or if they lay on battlefields feeling systems fail, feeling cold, spread as life support shut down and augmetics went still. The end came quietly, not as combat, not as explosion or blade, just cessation. My heart slowed until it stopped. My lungs took fewer and fewer breaths until they didn't take another. Consciousness faded, not into clean darkness, but into a gray thinning where thoughts lost edges and sensation drifted away. My last coherent thought wasn't a prayer or a curse. It was simply the acknowledgement that felt necessary to make before dissolution took me. I had been human once, and I was dying human again, or as close to human as I could manage after everything that had been done to me. It wasn't comfort, not exactly, but it was something. One small claim of identity against the vast, indifferent machinery that had consumed me and would continue consuming others long after my flesh was recycled and my augmetics were bolted into the next recruit who still believed the same lies I had believed.